Have you ever just looked around and felt like there's some kind of hidden pattern to everything? You know, a secret code. One that if we could just crack it, it would explain it all, from the way galaxies spin to how life itself works. Well, for basically all of human history, we've been on a quest for that one single unifying idea.
And you know, it's funny, this isn't a new idea. 400 years ago, Galileo basically said the universe is a book, and you can't read it unless you understand its language, and that language is mathematics. The thinking has always been that reality itself is built on some kind of mathematical foundation, just waiting for us to figure it out.
And for a lot of people, that whole search has really zeroed in on one number in particular, phi, what we call the golden ratio. You've probably heard it called the divine proportion. It's supposed to be this master key that pops up everywhere, in famous art, all over nature, even in the proportions of our own bodies. But is it the real deal?
Well, let's fast forward to today, because there's this really fascinating and, let's be clear, highly speculative modern theory that claims to have found a physical, measurable version of this ancient number, a discovery that it argues could unlock a true theory of everything. And it all starts right here with something called the Vinci Power Nap pendulum. So what is it? It's basically a biotech system designed to help you relax and recharge. You lie down in this cocoon-like thing in a totally zero-gravity position, and it just gently sways you back and forth, kind of like a giant high-tech cradle.
So while doing research on this pendulum, the scientists noticed something really specific. The system would naturally settle into this one particular rhythm, a resonant frequency of 0.618 hertz. Now, if you know anything about the golden ratio, that number 0.618 should be setting off some serious bells right now.
The researchers even gave it a name, the frequency of harmony. And get this, the frequency was 0.618, which is the inverse of the golden ratio. And the period, that's the time it takes for one full swing, was 1.618 seconds, the golden ratio itself. So from this, they made a truly breathtaking claim, that this frequency might just be the fundamental pattern of all creation. And I mean, the scope of this claim is just wild. The paper they wrote connects this one single frequency from a pendulum to, well, everything. Quantum biology, cosmology, and even the biggest holy grails in all of physics, M-theory and the theory of everything, the ideas that try to knit all the forces of the universe into one beautiful package.
Okay, but hold on a second. Any theory that claims to do all that has to be built on a rock-solid foundation, right? So, let's put on our investigator hats for a minute and go check the historical pillars that this whole thing is resting on.
Now this theory, like a lot of theories about the golden ratio, leans heavily on Leonardo da Vinci's famous drawing, the Vitruvian Man. It's held up as the historical proof, right? The blueprint showing that the golden ratio is fundamental to the perfect human form.
But that brings up a really crucial question. Was Leonardo drawing a beautiful idea, an artistic ideal of what a perfect man could look like? Or was he documenting a universal scientific law about how all of us are actually built?
Well, let's just look at the data. This table puts Leonardo's ideal proportions right next to modern averages from a huge study of over 60,000 Air Force recruits. And what's fascinating is how incredibly close he was on some things, like shoulder width. That's amazing. But then you look at other things like thigh length or arm span, and, well, they're not even close. He was clearly drawing an ideal, not a scientific reality. And that whole distinction, an artistic ideal versus a scientific fact, is the perfect way to start looking at the central pillar of this entire theory, this widespread belief that the golden ratio is some kind of secret code that's been embedded in the world's greatest masterpieces for centuries. And maybe the most famous example of all is the Parthenon in Athens. I'm sure you've seen the diagrams, right? The ones with the perfect golden rectangle laid over the front of the building, fitting like a glove. But here's the thing. When you actually go and measure the building, the whole idea just falls apart. This quote from a scientific review says it all. It's just not supported by the actual measurements. Turns out, those perfect diagrams you see online often have to cheat a little. They'll include a bunch of empty space above the roof or cut off the bottom steps just to make the rectangle fit. Okay, so the Parthenon doesn't quite hold up. But what about the master himself, Leonardo? The next big claim is that he was secretly embedding this ratio in all of his work. I mean, it makes sense, right? He was a genius of both art and science, so why wouldn't he use a divine formula?
Well, here's the real kicker. We can just go look at his notebooks. The man wrote about everything, especially human anatomy and proportion, and yet there is not one single mention of the golden ratio in connection to beauty. It seems pretty clear he just didn't think it was all that important for his art.
So when you start connecting the dots, you see how this whole myth got built up over time. The idea of the golden ratio of some kind of universal law of beauty, that really only took off in the 1800s. The name phi? Totally modern. Even the ancient Greeks, like Euclid, just saw it as one of many mathematical ratios. Nothing special. And yet, even that famous Nautilus shell, it's not a perfect match for the golden spiral.
So if the historical foundations are basically sand, why is this idea so powerful? It brings up a much bigger question. Why are we as humans so drawn to these kinds of grand, all-encompassing theories in the first place? Why do we want to find a secret code?
It really boils down to this challenge, doesn't it? That 0.618 hertz frequency from the pendulum, that is a genuinely compelling, interesting piece of data. No doubt about it. But how do we know if it's a deep clue about how the universe works, or if it's just an interesting measurement from one specific pendulum?
Let me give you a quick analogy. Remember during the pandemic when a student wrote this great article about how remote learning was amazing for her? She was thriving. That was one single, very compelling data point. But as a teacher quickly pointed out, her story wasn't a universal truth. For tons of other kids, the reality was the exact opposite. It's such an easy trap to fall into, taking one powerful story and thinking it explains the whole picture.
So if that's how we get it wrong, how do good scientific models get built? Well, let's contrast this with a really successful mathematical model, like game theory. Now, game theory is not based on some mystical number someone found lying around in nature.
No, it's built from the ground up based on observable, testable principles about how people make rational choices. You see the difference? Successful models aren't about finding a magic number and trying to make everything fit it. They're about observing reality and figuring out the rules from there.
So, let's just quickly retrace our steps. We started out captivated by this idea of a secret code to the universe. We dove into a modern theory that claimed to have found it in a pendulum. But then, when we put its foundations under the microscope, we found they were more myth than math. And that kind of forced us to ask ourselves why we're so eager to find these simple, elegant answers to begin with.
And all of this leaves us with one last big thought to wrestle with. The human brain is a pattern-finding machine. It's what we do. But our greatest challenge, always, is knowing the difference. Knowing when we are truly discovering a pattern that's out there in the universe and when we are simply imposing a pattern that exists only in our own minds.